Welcome to Temple University Japan campus, to our first event of the year. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Eriko and Emily, and also all our student workers, without whom we couldn't run these events, so a round of applause for them. As I always say, brevity is a source of wit, and you surely didn't come here to listen to me. So I just would like to say I'm extremely happy to have Robert here. He's been a very active participant in our events in New York and Tokyo as well. And the floor is yours for about 30 minutes. And just to let you know, this session is being recorded. So during Q&A, if you don't want to be seen on our YouTube channel, just ask your question from your seat, and then you will not be recorded. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. I had the great pleasure of going to Robert's house in New York, or apartment in New York, and having sessions there and meeting all sorts of interesting people from this world. And then when I was on a Fulbright here, and also on an Abe fellowship here, I used to come here, although to a much less nice room, to events all the time, and met a lot of people. Actually, I saw Ben Karp last night, who I met here years ago, giving an address here. So it's sort of like coming home in a nice way. So my name's Robert Boynton. I'm a professor of journalism at New York University. I'm not a Asian specialist of any sort. I'm a journalist. I'm a generalist. And this project is something that started in 2008 when I got a fellowship from the Japan Society. It was a media fellowship, which sadly does not exist anymore. And the fellowship was expressly designed to give generalists an opportunity to come to Japan and pursue whatever they were interested in. And, you know, most fellowships now are very sort of directed, and you're this specialist and you go here and there. But that kind of generalist sort of education is fascinating and I think very healthy. For instance, I came here with my son when he was 5. He's now 14, and he's learning hiragana and katakana and memorizing kanji, and he's half Korean. He's desperate for doing this stuff. So these things pay dividends beyond just the individuals. This book came about because I was fascinated by the abduction issue, as I'm going to describe in this presentation. And then I pursued it for the next 8 years, coming to Japan for anywhere between 4 weeks and 4 months every year between 2008 and 2014. And I put together this multimedia presentation for 2 reasons. One is that I hate readings. I find them very boring to watch or listen to an author simply read from his book. And the second one was that I knew how difficult it would be to introduce some of these ideas, some of the history, some of the names to an English audience, to an American audience in particular. Famously, 38% of Americans can't find North Korea on a map, though we know we want to bomb it, which is the great American sort of combination of complete conviction and utter ignorance, So I was up against writing it took a long time because it was, as a narrative project. How do you? I'm a generalist. How do you tell stories? How do you introduce characters, but not too many characters, and a unfamiliar history, in a way that's going to bring all the stuff together? So I came up with this idea of doing this multimedia presentation. It's something I actually encourage my students, and we teach. In my journalism program, it's on literary reportage, long-form nonfiction, literary journalism. We do a lot of audio, This American Life kind of narrative audio, and also this kind of thing, where we're pulling together the fruits of our labor, the fruits of the reporting we've done, and trying to put them together in creative ways, and performing, essentially, busking. So that's becoming more of an important part of journalism as it goes along. So that's the way I've put this together, and so some of this material, since you are all Japan hands of one form or another, some of this will be very familiar to you, some of it not so much, but the way I put it together is for the reasons I mentioned. So I'll start. I can start off. What would you do if someone you loved vanished from the face of the earth. Not dying at the conclusion of a lingering illness or perishing in an automobile accident. No, what if you woke up one morning and your son, your daughter, your sister or your brother simply wasn't there? Gone. Missing. Reading the newspaper on the morning of October 16th, 2002, I came upon a story whose headline read, "Tears and Hugs as 5 Japanese Go Home to Visit." A quick internet search turned up a photograph of 5 middle-aged Japanese, 2 couples and a single woman, wearing boxy 1950s-era suits, thin ties and prim skirts, descending the steps of a Japan Airlines 727 at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. The story was almost too bizarre to believe. Evil frogmen emerging from an inky sea, snatching young couples from beaches, and transporting them by boat to Pyongyang, where they were held prisoner for decades. But here it is from one of the many made-for-TV Japanese dramas inspired by the abductions. People began disappearing from Japan's coastal towns and cities in the fall of 1977. A security guard vacationing at a seaside resort 200 miles northwest of Tokyo vanished in September. In November, a 13-year-old girl walking home from badminton practice in the port city of Niigata was last seen 800 feet from her front door. The next July, 2 young couples disappeared. One left behind the car they drove to a local makeout spot. The other couple abandoned the bicycles they rode to the beach. What few knew at the time was that they had been abducted by an elite unit of North Korean commandos. And Japanese were not the only victims. Some were abducted from the Middle East, Asia, and Eastern Europe during the same period. Their families spent years searching for the missing, checking mortuaries, hiring private detectives, and even consulting soothsayers. Only 5 Japanese were ever seen again. For the next quarter century, the abductees lived in a series of guarded communities on the outskirts of Pyongyang. Known as invitation-only zones, the fiction was that these were not prisons, but merely exclusive areas for which one required an invitation. The zones were essentially terrariums where, in addition to learning Japanese from the abductees, North Korean spies observed them on a daily basis. Resigned to their fate, the abductees learned Korean, got married, and had children, and tried to live as normally as possible in the totalitarian nation. Hitomi Soga, who was kidnapped while walking home from the local grocery store, married Charles Jenkins, an American sergeant who had defected to North Korea in 1969. In the background of Jenkins' vacation photo, you can see Anoka Panjoy, a Thai abductee who married another of the American deserters. And here is Yugumi Mokota, the 13-year-old Japanese girl who married an abductee from South Korea. They, like the others, attempted to pass as North Korean, hiding their identities even from their children, who grew up worshiping Kim Il-sung and performed in the Mass Games, an annual celebration of the North Korean state. Why had these unlucky souls been abducted in the first place? It seems the plan was to brainwash the abductees into believing the regime's ideology, a peculiar blend of Stalinism and Korean nationalism, and train them to spy on the state's behalf. When that project faltered, they were made to teach Korean spies how to pass as Japanese in order to infiltrate South Korea and other countries. Because the locations they were taken from were dispersed and their numbers relatively small, few drew a connection between the incidents in the late 1970s. When rumors about the abductions appeared in Japanese newspapers, they were treated like urban myths, akin to alien abductions. The police told the families of the missing that with no bodies or evidence of foul play, there was nothing for them to investigate. After all, thousands of people disappear every year, dying lonely deaths or fleeing drugs, debt, or unhappy relationships. It later turned out that some Japanese officials knew about the abductions at the time. They avoided acknowledging them officially, likely out of fear that doing so might get the abductees killed. And what, after all, could be done? Japan has neither diplomatic relations with North Korea nor a military that is allowed to take unilateral action. Shigata ga nai. It can't be helped, is the phrase Japanese often use to rationalize inaction. So they languished in the invitation-only zones until 2002, when Kim Jong-il allowed 5 of them to visit home. Why free them now? Between the death of its founder, Kim Il-sung, in 1994, and the famine that killed nearly 1 million people in the late 1990s, North Korea was on the brink of collapse. In January 2002, George W. Bush banished North Korea to the axis of evil. Desperate, Kim Jong-il asked to meet Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi, hoping to cultivate a wealthy ally who had good relations with the United States. Of the 13 Japanese that North Korea admitted taking, Kim claimed that 8 were dead. The circumstances of their deaths, however, were suspicious. One had succumbed to heart disease at the age of 27, another had committed suicide, and 2 others died in automobile accidents in a country with few cars. Also suspicious was the fact that all the death certificates were issued by the same hospital. 1 month after the summit, the 5 abductees arrived in Tokyo for a temporary visit. As I watched them disembark from the airplane, I wondered to myself, who were these people who had spent half their lives in the least accessible nation on earth? What might they tell us about this secretive country? Having split their lives between North Korea and Japan, with which did they identify? Had they been brainwashed? How many others had been abducted? Were any of them still alive? Japanese television ran non-stop live coverage all day, and the abductions became a national obsession, dominating the media for years. A public once relatively indifferent to North Korea now couldn't get enough news about the strange country. A government poll found that 80% of Japanese believed the 2 countries were on the brink of war. The look on the 5 abductees' faces alternated between joy and terror. Joy at seeing their loved ones after so much time, and terror that any of the army of reporters would ask them questions which, if answered truthfully, might imperil the sons and daughters left behind in North Korea as hostages. Their predicament was summed up by the 2 pins they wore on their lapels that October day. One was a blue flag, the symbol of the abductee rescue movement. The other was an image of Kim Il-sung, a pin that every North Korean is required to wear close to his heart. The 2 symbols, only inches from each other, represented irreconcilable narratives. One told the story of Japanese abductees escaping their North Korean jailers. The other was the story of loyal North Korean citizens visiting their families in Japan and then returning home to their children. 1 year before, the events of September 11th had shaken me. Standing on the roof of a Brooklyn brownstone, I saw the Twin Towers fall. I recoiled at the nationalism that swept through the country and was depressed as I watched the terrorists trick us into curtailing the very freedoms that have made us a great nation. In an odd way, I threw myself into the story of the abductions to avoid America's nervous breakdown. In 2002, Japan was also struggling to define its national character. Its economy in decline and its birth rate in free fall, its crisis of faith brought it to a crossroad. Was it the militarist aggressor? That that had colonized Asia and attacked the United States, or the pacifist victimized by an atomic bomb and now the abduction of its citizens? My Japanese friends told me that the abductions were Japan's 9/11. This puzzled me at first, but as I witnessed the country redoubling its counterterrorism strategy and tightening its immigration controls, I began to understand that Japan's 9/11 was less an event than a state of mind. Like the United States, Japan was traumatized by the sudden realization that the world was more dangerous than it had thought. A place where even the most prosperous and powerful nations are incapable of protecting themselves, whether from Al-Qaeda or North Korea. The Japanese people have been living in a greenhouse since the American occupation ended in 1952, the journalist Tsutomu Watanabe tells me. In 2002, we realized that the outside world was actually cold and hostile. And with trauma came the seduction of victimhood, a status that neither Japan nor the United States had much claim to. When I arrived at Narita Airport on a chilly March morning in 2008, I discovered that the story was stranger and more complex than I had imagined. The abductions had become a proxy for some of Asia's most vexed historical disputes, which continue to be fought over to this day. Whenever I'm in Tokyo, I stop in at the offices of Radio Shio, a shortwave broadcast that has been beamed into North Korea twice a day since 2006. The intended audience is abductees whom many believe are still being held captive. The programs are in Japanese, English, Chinese, and Korean, and each episode is a mix of international news and messages for individual abductees, often read by friends or relatives. The project is a pure act of faith, a broadcast whose signal is jammed, directed at a country where radios receive only official stations and where electricity is in scarce supply, to be heard by abductees who may not exist. Thank you. So, as I said, when I wrote this book, it was a real labor of love. It took many, many years to do, and when it came time to write it, I had a real dilemma. As I mentioned, Americans don't know anything about the rest of the world, or very little. The conventional wisdom is that books that don't have American characters won't sell, and so it's a real challenge. And one of the things I decided to do was I felt I had to really start with the emotional heart of the issue. And I felt like with the beginning of this, the emotional heart, when I told people the story, was really the idea that you would have a relative, a brother, a sister, a daughter, who disappeared with no resolution, no sense of an ending at all, and never knowing what happened. And, you know, this was the sort of the emotional chord that I found really resonated the most with people, regardless of whether they knew anything about East Asia or Korea or Japan or not. And I felt too that there was a truth to it, though, because, you know, the emotional core, that kind of loss was a sense of loss that I think that certainly the parents of the abductees and the abductees themselves, who talked to me often about their loss of their family back home and how hard that was, but also Japan's loss of a sense of its certain direction, a sense of its certain identity, and I think also a sense of loss of faith in its government at this point, where it was revealed that there had been all sorts of indications about the abductions earlier on, which the mainstream media had known about, which the government had known about, on and off. And I think there was a real sort of moment, dramatic moment, as described to me by many of the activists, primarily people like Sato Katsumi, who was this fantastic character, hardcore communist who became a hardcore activist, right-wing zealot, who was very much working on behalf of the abductees. He described how, he said, at that moment when they came down off of that plane, he said, you felt the entire moral compass of Japan turn 180 degrees. The sense that, it's something that's hard to imagine. I can't think of a parallel where, what a small group has been saying on the media, and also, all these getting petitions signed as people walked by, the mainstream liberal dominant media disbelieving them. And then all of a sudden, there it is. This actually happened. Here are the people. I say the only thing I can compare it to is if someone said to you, those kind of crazy stories you've been reading in supermarket tabloids about alien abduction? Well, it actually happened. It's all true. And that, I think, was sort of captures some of the sort of astonishment of that moment. So I figured that if I started off with something as basic and human as that sense of connection, that sense of loss, that then I could sort of go on and get my readers to go with me on a journey that would go into a lot of history, because I believe that the abduction issue, for all of the sort of so-called history wars that go on, there's not a lot of history involved. It's a lot of sort of claims of history, and I really wanted to take it through and try to understand, why is it that Korea, North and South, and Japan, why is it that they have such a terrible relationship at times? Now, the easy answer is colonialism, but that's not really an answer. Japan and Taiwan have a very good relationship. England and India have good relationship. There are all sorts of cases where erstwhile colonial powers are perfectly friendly with their former colonies. So I really wanted to dig into that, and I tried to tell that story and tried to explore that through the story of the origins of Japanese anthropology, the Meiji Restoration, the way that the Western pseudoscience of race and ideas about evolution and Darwin came via Edward Morse and others, the incredible stories of the Japanese anthropologist, father of anthropology, Torii Ryozo, and the way that he used these new ideas, this new science, to really write the first modern history of Japan and of Korea, and how that created a certain idea of identity that I think sort of casts a pall to this day over the relationships between the archipelago and the peninsula. So I tried to really give some sort of intellectual context to what was going on, using the abductions as sort of a lens to look at this, because it seemed to me that it was a very telling example of people who had tried to find meaning in two different cultures. They were sort of liminal people in a way. And I was very lucky in the beginning of my reporting to get an interview with one of the most articulate and thoughtful of the abductees, a man named Hasuike Karu. So in 2008, I arrived here as a naive generalist journalist, and I wrote him a letter, and I said, I've been thinking about these abductions since I read about it in 2002. I'd love to interview you. And he wrote me back, and his letter said, well, I'll receive your interview on 3 conditions. The first condition is that you pay me. The second condition is that you tell me precisely what you're going to use this information for. And the third condition is that we not discuss the abductions. And I thought, okay. So I wrote him back and I said, look, in America, you can't pay your subjects. It undercuts the legitimacy of your project, though God knows if anyone deserves to be paid, it's you. Second question, I can't tell you what I'm doing. This is the very beginning of this project. I don't know if it's going to be an article or a book or an essay or what. So I'm not going to lie to you and tell you I know what to do. And the third one, okay, we won't discuss the abduction. We won't discuss the abduction issue. We can talk about translation, because at the time, Hasuike-san was supporting himself by translating literature, nonfiction and fiction, from Korean to Japanese. And he said, fine, come to Kashiwazaki and we'll talk. So my interpreter and I headed up to Niigata, took the train over to Kashiwazaki, and spent the day with Hasuike-san. And he, the interview was going very well. But in journalism, there's a situation where interviews can go almost too well. You're polite and nice, they're polite and nice, and I think this especially afflicts societies that are more civilized than the one I come from. And so it was going very, very well, and I thought, okay, this is, I'm great. I'm getting to meet this guy, but I'm not really getting much. So I said, I decided to sort of take it up a notch, and I said, in interpretation, my understanding of interpretation, it's really important for the interpreter to understand not just the languages, but both cultures each language comes from. And he said, oh, yes, I agree, yes. And I said, every culture is a mixture of good and bad. No culture is either all good or all bad. And he said, oh, yes, absolutely, I agree with you completely, yes. And I said, so tell me about the good parts of North Korea. Tell me about what was really great there and, things that you maybe happy times you had or something. And he looked at me, and you could tell the thought cloud was, this guy's either the biggest idiot or such an ass that he's asking me this question. And he exploded. He said, you do understand that I was abducted by North Korea, not South Korea. I was taken against my will and held for there. I was a victim of human rights violation and all that sort of stuff. And my translator, my interpreter, who's a wonderful guy, was, trying to sort of, that kind of thing. And at that point, it had calmed down, and then we had this fantastic conversation. And again, sort of using the metaphor of interpretation, of translation, which ended up being a very fortunate one, we had this fantastic conversation about going between two cultures and what it is to live between two cultures. And I felt like he was able to, dispense with all this sort of crap, the North Koreans are awful and I'm a pure victim, and, which both those things have a certain truth to them. But we were able to discuss what was interesting to me, which is the middle part. You're 19, you end up in North Korea, you realize you have an entire life ahead of you. A year and a half later, you realize that your girlfriend, who you were going to marry anyway, is there, and you're going to have a life with her. You know that no one knows you're there. He was under no illusions he was about to be rescued. How do you make a life? What are the quotidian details of living and daily life? And this is what we talked about. And when I met other of the abductees, Yasushi and Fukie Shimura, and talked with poor Mr. Jenkins, who just passed away recently, about his life, but also the wife of his wife, Soga Hitomi. The things I was interested in was not, Yongbyon and nuclear weapons and Kim Jong-il. It was, what did you do every day? And how did you had a garden in the back, and you started growing, cabbage, and you started to like kimchi, and you hadn't liked kimchi before. And, how do you educate your kids? They have to be told this thing. You really can't let them know that you're Japanese abductees. That's a state secret. How do you tell them? What's the story? Oh, you say you were Zainichi, you returned home during this period, and that's why you're Korean. Is funny. And these things that people were very happy and interested in talking about. There were things that I think they had never been asked before. In fact, I know they'd never been asked before, because when I interviewed Yasushi and Fukie Shimura, I went to her father has a ryokan in Obama, and I spent the weekend there, and they agreed to come and do an interview. And as many of you know, they are not interviewed. The Japanese mainstream media made a very interesting decision not to inflict their presence on these abductees, not to push them. So to this day, the abductee correspondents have not met or talked to most of the abductees. Hasuike, a little bit different, because he's written a few books now and has entertained interviews as an author, not as an abductee. And so we're sitting there talking, and I'm thinking, okay, it was a nice big dinner. And her father specialized in fugu, so we had all this fugu, and that was kind of cool. And I lived to tell the tale, and the entire family's sitting around there. And I thought, Jesus, when's this thing going to start? I know they have to get up next morning to go to work. And I realized the family wasn't leaving. So I did an interview. It was the most uncomfortable interview of my life. I did an interview of both Fukie and Yasushi with my interpreter, and like a dozen family members all sitting around on the floor eating, right? And as I started talking to them, I realized that none of them had heard these stories. None of them knew this information. And I said, at one point, I said to Fukie, who was this spark plug and fantastically descriptive and wonderful personality, just lovely woman. And I said, surely someone's asked you this stuff before. And she went, oh, no, no one would ever be that rude, which was a nice way of telling me how rude I was. And that was, fine. That's the role I play here oftentimes. But it was amazing to me. And I confirmed it afterwards. I said, have you ever talked to her about this? No, we never talked about this stuff. So, a lot of this, too, it felt like, again, there was this sort of, the themes I kept on returning to was the things that people won't speak about, the intimate connections between Korean and Japanese civilization that we all know are there, that my father-in-law, who's born in Hamhung, North Korea, will admit in a second all the overlaps, all the connections between the two cultures. That, these are the kinds of things that I think attach to the abduction issue that in the larger context of Japanese and Korean history that I wanted to explore. And these were the characters I wanted to use to explore through them. And they were gracious enough to give me quite a bit of time, and various foundations, some of whom are represented here, were also gracious enough to give me some funding so I could come back again and again and ask my stupid questions and offend people over and over again. But this kind of reporting really takes that. It's not experts or policy types coming and sort of figuring things out. It's going back again and again and asking the same question and trying to figure things out from an outside perspective. So I like to think that what I offer, believe me, I'm not going to teach anyone in Japan any information about the abductions, but I think I bring an enlightened and well-meaning outsider's approach to this story and a sense of the story, because what happened here was really extraordinary in so many different ways. The kind of activism, the kind of incredible journalism. Ishidaka Kenji, who really sort of broke the story and worked through the story. I have his story in there. And the various of these kind of, very right-wing activists who I became very close friends of mine and very good sources, people who I wouldn't have probably had nothing in common with any other way. You could tell the entire story of post-war Japan through Sato Katsumi, who, was one of these 14-year-olds who signed up to the very last days of the war and became disillusioned with the emperor and then became disillusioned with the Americans and then became a communist and a great believer in Kim Il-sung and worked with the repatriation, sending 90+ thousand ethnic Koreans to North Korea. I was about to say back to, but none of them were from there. And then became disillusioned and became a very right-wing, very skeptical activist and worked in the abductions. It's amazing. That kind of sort of Whittaker Chambers-like character, just larger than life. Anyway, it was my great privilege to be able to explore that and explore it as an outsider without some of the constraints that Japanese journalists and other people feel, or don't feel. I don't mean it in at all an unserious way, that they operate under. And it was really my good fortune to be able to sort of blunder into these things and keep coming back and asking stupid questions. But anyway, I like to take some questions if you have them about the whole phenomenon. Yeah, Robert.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Exactly half an hour.
I'll take the advantage of running the show to ask the first question. It's been known for decades that these things happened. I remember studying Japan in the 80s. It was known that North Koreans had abducted Japanese.
I'm not sure
was
it's
a
that
lot
well
written
known.
about it, and then suddenly it became a big thing. Partly Abe used it as a political stepping stone. Most of the articles and you read about this point out that there were LDP politicians who were close to pro-North Korean groups, and that this is one reason this thing was hidden from the front pages. It was not a state secret, but wasn't publicized. So can you tell us why did this suddenly become a big issue well after the Japanese police, the Japanese authorities had established that in most likelihood North Korea had kidnapped Japanese nationals?
This was one of the most fascinating parts, and again, this was part of sort of my education in things East Asian, things Japanese, because there are levels of knowing, right? There are levels of letting things be known and acknowledging them. And, I've had plenty of people say, I was a beat reporter in Niigata, everyone knew about this thing. I'm not sure I quite believe that. But, in 1978, Sankei Shimbun ran a front page article by Abe-san, a different Abe reporter, saying, 4 people, the pictures of all 4 of them disappeared. Now, it didn't say North Korea, it said a third country, which is sort of interesting terminology. And in 1980, Asahi Shimbun actually didn't mention North Korea, the famously liberal Asahi Shimbun, which, bends over backward. No, it actually did. It had a headline saying North Korea abducted people. In 1987 was the very first sort of quote-unquote evidence when Kim Hyung-hee, the North Korean terrorist who blew up an airliner in 1987, was interviewed by Hitoshi Tanaka and others, and said that she had been trained in Japanese culture and language by a Japanese woman who had been abducted. So, but then came the question of what do, right? You don't have diplomatic relations, you don't have an army, you don't have, and the North Koreans deny it. So there's this very interesting dance for negotiations for years where in various level negotiations, the Japanese would come in and they would say, we're talking about this, and we also like to talk about the abducted Japanese. The North Korean diplomats would get up and leave the room. That's it. So then they figured out, all right, we'll call them missing Japanese. Oh, missing Japanese. Oh, well, we'll look for them, right? They went around and looked for the missing Japanese. We didn't find any, right? Okay, so that didn't work. There was even and Prime Minister Mori sort of let this loose. There was under Mori's prime ministership, there was a plan floated to take the abductees and release them throughout Europe randomly, Paris, Barcelona, whatever, and they just show up and be like, oh, I just don't know how I got here, that kind of thing. That was going to save face for everybody. So there are all these different layers of knowing, but it was really it was when they came off a plane, or when actually the month before when Abe went to Pyongyang and met with Kim Jong-il, that was the first real revelation of it. And I think until that time, there was such, and this again is something the people in the audience understand better than I do, but there was so much sensitivity about portraying Koreans badly, and I've had plenty of reporters from all sorts of papers say every time we wrote an article, that had anything critical of whether it was Mindan or Chosun Soren, we'd get protests and flyers and nasty phone calls. It wasn't worth it. So I think that there was no real upside to pursuing this kind of a story. You couldn't confirm it. It only caused problems for you, and nothing was really going to come of it anyway. And I think that for those, when Arimoto Keiko's mother got a letter from her daughter in North Korea saying we're being held here, and that's a great story, great chapter in the book. Make sure to read it. She went to her Diet member and they said, oh, for God's sake, don't say anything. They'll kill her. So she wasn't going to do anything. So they, there was this sense of, very honest sense of, what do you do? What can you do? So the whole question of didn't everyone know? The way people, it's very fashionable to say, well, this is about this sort of the Me Too stuff. Oh, everyone knew that Harvey Weinstein was a scamp and was raping everyone. Did everyone know? I don't know. Sort of knew, kind of knew, didn't, So I think there was a little bit of that. And afterwards, everyone's like, oh, yeah, I knew that. Anyway, that's my reflection on not knowing. Other questions? Oh, for God's sake, there must be other questions. I know the question.
David Satterwhite, thanks very much for the multimedia show as well, and how articulate you are on these issues. Good to see you again. I hadn't really formulated a full series of questions, but let me start with, in the presentation, there was an ascending number that went over 300. And so let me start by saying, and I haven't read your book, I just picked it up yesterday, what is your sense from everything you've done of what an accurate number might be? Second, you, in your very fast response to that last question, fast talked response, you mentioned
I'm a New Yorker, I talk fast.
There you go. You mentioned that when Abe went to Pyongyang, but I think it was Koizumi who went, and Abe was there.
Yeah.
The story that I've heard is that Koizumi was told very, very firmly by Mr. Abe, who's now Prime Minister, don't you dare smile while you're in North Korea. And sure enough, none of the pictures show him smiling at all. But that sort of background, and I'll get to the question. It's been said that the abductees abducted Japanese foreign policy vis-a-vis the Korean Peninsula and any rapprochement with North Korea. And in the context of the Koizumi trip that was originally designed to, as I understand it, seek a closer relationship and maybe opening of diplomatic relations, going back to the cross-recognition formula in which the Soviet Union and then and China recognized South Korea, the U.S. and Japan never recognized North Korea. That sense of Japan's foreign policy having been abducted by the issue, so can't get beyond it to any form of rapprochement. The current Prime Minister appears to be utilizing the entire spectrum, specter of North Korea, very much for political purposes as well. Just like to hear your, I recognize that you came to it as a journalist, and the human element is powerful. But in all of who you interviewed and what you've come to know, any commentary on what I was just rambling about?
Sure,
Thanks.
sure. There's a lot there. I mean, in terms of the Abe using the abduction issue early on, and then most recently, I mean, my God, this last election, I mean, they should send Kim Jong-un a thank you note. I mean, you know, what was better publicity for the? I mean, here's a guy whose popularity is here, and yet he wins the election. It's sort of extraordinary, and I think you don't have to be a political scientist to attribute a lot of that to the threat from the North. And also, I think for the first time, certainly close to the first time, the nuclear issue surpassed the abduction issue as an issue of concern in polling in Japan, which is kind of extraordinary too. In terms of the numbers, I'd be lying if I said I know anything. You know, I hate when people say, oh, Megumi's dead and Megumi's alive, and they're all, you know, I mean, a lot of those are talking points. No one knows anything. The numbers are it's a story in itself. I mean, Araki Kazuhiro, who runs this Shio Kaze, Radio Shio Kaze, and this other group of people who were suspected to be abducted, is the name of the organization. He's a really interesting guy, and I have a section on him in the book and his relation to Sato. And he, you know, he decided, since there was this sort of government list of 13 people, right, and that was his ironclad list, no one's going to be added to it, and yet he kept on getting calls from people saying that, well, you know, my son or daughter disappeared in similar circumstances. Do you think you can help? Do you think you can do something? So he started keeping a list and decided that someone had to take care of these other people. And the background of why it is that he felt the need to do this is that, you know, Soga Hitomi, the woman abducted with her mother from Sado Island, she wasn't on anyone's list. You know, the Japanese had no idea that she was gone at all. The North Koreans gave her, you know, put her on the list. So therefore, everyone who had lost anyone thought, wait a second, see, maybe that mine too. And as Araki described to me, I kept on getting these phone calls. Do you think maybe my daughter? So he started keeping this list. Now the list got bigger and bigger, and people kept on falling on and off the list. I used to joke, I mean, it's sort of a dark joke, but I would joke that if you were late to dinner, you had a good chance of getting on the list. You know, it was a very expansive list. And I always thought it was sort of, you know, not silly, but I mean, it was sort of this kind of, this is the big picture. We're going to keep it alive for all times. And then I woke up one day and the Abe government was using the same list. And all of a sudden they went from 13 people to say, yeah, we think they're about 400 or 500. And I was just stunned by that. I would think that, wouldn't you want to keep the list as small as possible, not as large? When I first started this, I was interviewing Nakayama Keiko was the time the abduction minister. And I'd been interviewing a lot of these Yodogo Red Army types and their wives who would come back. And I had a pretty good sense that there were perhaps some political compatriots of this group who were there, who weren't able to return. They weren't, strictly speaking, abductees, but they were Japanese citizens who couldn't come home. And there had been some rumors that the North Koreans had sort of said, well, we'll get you some Japanese, and maybe not the ones you want, but these other ones. And I said to her, well, why wouldn't they be on the list? And she went nuts. And she also exploded at me and said, why, we know there's this list and no other list and everything. So the whole number thing has been very, very interesting and very, very powerful. And I guess the Abe people have figured that a bigger list is a better thing, and you know, than they needed to. But those are some of the. Did I address everything? Those are some of the things that I encountered. Yes, sir.
Nobuya Sabe, I'm a former diplomat, but I'm a pensioner now. I guess there are some American counterparts to Japanese abductees. In a way, some Americans disappeared on Korea-China border or some known to be detained. How do you see the difference? Is there any difference how Americans react to this kind of question from the Japanese reaction? How do you compare them?
Well, yeah, there is one case of an American, a Mormon American hiker who was on the North Korean Chinese border, who disappeared. His parents and a lot of other people are convinced he was abducted. He spoke fluent Korean. There have been, of course, now reports of him teaching Kim Jong-un's kid English or something like that in Pyongyang. I have no idea whether it's true or not. I mean, one thing is that there was no violation of sovereignty, which I think was a big part of the Japanese, the wound of the Japanese. We thought we were safe, and we weren't. He was over there. So, and this one case has not gotten much attention at all. It's very little known. Otto Warmbier, the American tourist who was there, who was arrested, eventually lapsed into a coma and was sent back and then died. That got more attention because he was a young man with promise who was just a tourist, and so that people were more outraged, and that got more of attention. The Trump administration, of course, cynically used it against Obama to say that he hadn't done enough, and but this issue just doesn't resonate in the same way. I know active members of the Japanese government have tried to sort of get some sympathy going on with the logic being, if you also have some skin in the game, maybe we too, we can make common cause. And I think it's only gotten them so far. I've often said, and in fact I said earlier this evening, that I felt like the more the abduction issue was addressed as a human rights issue, in which Japanese were a significant and important part, as the United Nations COI report did. It's extraordinary. I mean, it's just as a work of journalism, it's amazing. This thorough report, hearings in Tokyo and Seoul and all sorts of places with this Kirby, this judge, Australian judge, who has this sort of this incredible mind, and it was really extraordinary thing, and the abductions were a very big part of that. And I felt like that document and that effort to sort of universalize the Japanese experience, as opposed to trying to simply draw attention to the to the Japanese exception, was very successful. But I just don't think it's going to. It would take a lot to get the United States sort of exercised about something like that, I think. I mean, the closest would come is the POW/MIA movement of people perhaps left in Vietnam, which I think had a real effect for a certain number of years, but I'm not sure that that's really a parallel. Yes, sir.
My name is Kurt Sieber, Austrian Business Council. Quite a long way from North Korea. My question is, at one stage, the situation changed in North Korea, and that was the time when ultimately Koizumi-san brought back 5 of the abductees. There were 3 more coming back, but they were not abductees. They were either born in, and of course, Charles Jenkins, right. He was a defector, but they let him come back to his wife and children, to her mother, to their mother. So what was the situation, from your perspective, that the situation at that time, Koizumi-san was allowed to bring these 5 abductees back, and bigger problem really is that the North Koreans, they admitted to the abductions, which was a tremendous loss of face. After all the many years they have denied anything of that kind. What was the deciding factor? That is my question. And secondly then, why did it not continue after that? for the remaining 8? Of course, the official version is that the other 8 are dead, but there are some stories to that in both directions.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that those are two questions. One is the loss of face part. I mean, after, and this took, again, I'm again an outsider, this took a while for me to understand. My first reaction was, well, so they just go back to the negotiating board, right? You know, it didn't work the first time. They came home, this entire agreement blew up in their faces. But you know, Kim Jong-il lost face, and it was impossible during his lifetime to ever come back to that issue and renegotiate. I think Kim Jong-un, I mean, I don't know whether there's any likelihood of his doing it, but he could certainly do it in a way that his father could not. With the Jenkins and the children, that was a sort of slightly different case. Jenkins had defected in 1969. He was still wanted for desertion and was court-martialed and had some trepidation, obviously, about coming right back to Japan. He went through Indonesia instead. But the real break was between in 2002 when the 5 adults came back, and then there were 5 children who were still there from the Ichimuras and the Hasuikes, and they that took well. I mean, you deal with North Korea. It took more bribery. I mean, they gave them a lot more stuff. They gave them tons and tons of grain and lots of money. And 2 years later, 18 months later, he was able to bring the children back. And as to why it hasn't continued with the others, I think there's this sort of this stalemate where the Japanese government's official position is that they're all alive and we want them all. And the North Koreans' official position, as far as I understand, it changes a bit, is they're not alive. We can't produce someone who's not alive, but we'll look into it if you give us more money. You know, I mean, this is, I mean, I'm under no illusions about the way the North Koreans operate. I mean, even with this meeting yesterday or day before yesterday at Panmunjom, I mean, you know, this is the North Koreans inserting themselves into the Olympics, you know, getting Moon Jae-in's hopes up so that they can then blackmail them for something. I mean, that's the way the North Koreans, that's the way they roll. That's what they do. And it's, you know, sometimes it's blackmail for a lot, sometimes it's for a little. With the case with Koizumi and the deal that Tanaka Hitoshi negotiated, although he denies it, you know, they wanted, as Mr. Satterwhite said before, they wanted the same deal that the South got in '65, which they estimate was about $10 billion. And, you know, they would have they would take something like that. And that was, I think, what the deal was. And I think that if anything's going to go forward, they're not going to, they don't go down. If anything, they'll go up in what they require. And they're playing the long game. I mean, the sad thing, tragic thing, is they are waiting for the parents of the abductees to die. They know that when someone as wonderful and as powerful a presence as Yokota Sakie dies, that the next generation, as much as, you know, her brothers have Megumi's brothers have stepped up and others, it doesn't carry the same sort of force. And they're playing the long game. They know that, you know, that this will dissipate in some way. And that's when they'll try to make some sort of a deal, I think.
May I follow up? Yeah. Well, I also heard the story about the money, and the figure which was mentioned was something like $350 million. Yeah, it's
here.
But that's a different story. My next question is, the young lady, Megumi-san, the young lady who even made it to President Trump's agenda, and whom, as you said, was married to a South Korean who was abducted to the north, yes. And they had a daughter, and the parents of Megumi, they had the chance to see that daughter in Mongolia. Now, if the mother were still to be alive, and that is again a different story, yes or no. How could this meeting take place? Was it it was out of North Korea, it was in Mongolia in a kind of neutral territory. So what is your view on that situation?
Well, it was so this was a meeting, I can't remember the exact, 2014 maybe, 13, I can't remember the exact year it took place. This was a meeting that the North had been trying to lure the Yokotas up there to meet their daughter, as you say, for quite some time. And I've interviewed them a few times. I interviewed her once, and this was around that time they made that offer, and I said, so why don't you go meet your granddaughter, you know? She said, well, they'll use it for propaganda. I said, well, of course they'll use it for propaganda. That's what they do. But why don't you want to meet your granddaughter? And she said, well, they won't let me. And I said, who's they? I said, well, the other members of the Tsukukai and Kazukai and the other, you know, the people who were really manipulating it and using it for political gains. And I was just outraged. I said, you're the moral heart of this movement. How should you let them tell you what to do, you know? And, you know, she's much too polite to say more than that. And she indeed, as you mentioned, did end up going to Ulaanbaatar and meeting not only her granddaughter, but his granddaughter's daughter, her great-granddaughter, because Nyong'an had a child, a daughter, since then. And they were limited from what they could talk about, and they were also talking through a translator. So I don't know what, and it was all supposedly all off the record too. So I don't think she's ever spoken about it. But yes, it would be hard to not to ask, you know, is your mother still alive? Is my daughter still alive or something? But I don't think that was ever addressed or answered.
Yeah, okay. So
Yeah.
coming back to Megumi-san, her remains, or
Oh, God,
what
yeah.
the North Koreans
Yeah.
said were her bones, and they sent them back and said, well, that's it, she is dead, and that's the urn where she kind of was buried. Yeah. So,
Right.
and then Japan, and that was also in one of the presentations of, I don't remember which minister it was who was in charge,
Yeah.
because I think in the last 20 years, the minister in charge of North Korea changed about 20 times.
Well, the abduction, the officer for abduction, when they shuffle
Yeah,
the cabinet
yeah,
every time. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the Japanese side claimed that these they checked
The Japanese side claims that they checked
DNA
it. Right.
was not equivalent to the DNA of Megumi,
Right.
whereas some experts in and out of Japan claimed that if it is impossible to define the DNA
Right.
in bones which have been burned,
Right.
and so on. So,
Right. This is
any
this is
view
the,
on this?
this is
That's
the
my
this is
last
the
question.
okay. This is the grassy knoll sort of level of abduction conspiracy theory. So thank you. You obviously know a lot about this. So yes, there's this disagreement, controversy about the North Korean, the Japanese said we want proof that Megumi is not alive. The North Koreans said, well, we will present some of her remains, but don't test. You have to promise not to test them. Which is, yeah. So it's a big surprise. The Japanese tested them. To my understanding, they found, and this is the part where it's hazy, whether it was that they found it was her remains and someone else's, or whether they were not her remains. There's a fantastic article in Nature magazine, which I think can speak to this better than I can. I think the scientific consensus is that it was a mix of remains or something like that. The person, the geneticist who did the testing, was, I think, quite soon afterwards employed by the Japanese government and has not given any interviews. I tried to talk to him as I went down that road, but so I'm not sure where that is. But you know, how do you prove that someone is not there, especially during a country that's had this sort of famine, has had all these floods and things like that? So it's not not to be an apologist for the North Koreans, for God's sake, but there is a real dilemma about how do you prove a negative, how do you show a negative that way. So and I think it's sadly it might go on and on and on.
What happens after your book?
Oh God, I'd rather take her question. I don't know. Yeah.
And thank you for the wonderful video presentation. I might consider doing the same for my next presentation. So after reading your book, there's still one question that perplexed me, is the motivation of North Korea's abduction. So I remember you asked one of the abductees, I remember his Kaze.
Kaoru, yeah.
You asked him also the question, why
Yeah.
do you think,
Why were you abducted? And he says, we were just a chit to play at some future negotiation, something like that.
yeah, and then he say still a paradox to him.
Yeah.
So, and then in the past few years, there are a lot of theories, and one they pointed to North Korea's intention to undermine South Korea regime, especially connected to 1987, the Korea air was bombed
Right.
by a North Korean bomber
Yeah,
that,
terrorist, yeah.
that held a false Japanese passport,
Correct.
and linked to the 1988, maybe it's North Korea's intention to disrupt the Seoul
Olympics, yes.
So I haven't seen the South Korea part mentioned much in the book, so I was wondering
yeah.
how you see South Korea.
That's a really good point, and it's something I have to say, if I were to do it again, I would address this more directly. And it's come up in a number of these presentations. You know, the North Koreans didn't abduct Japanese to get back at Japan. That was not the point. Japan was, you know, there's a phrase in English, you know, collateral damage. I mean, the goal in North Korea, look, Kim Jong-un on January 1st said it. We want to reunify or unify the peninsula. That's the goal. That's the goal. They needed Japanese who could train, either be spies or train spies to pass, whether in South Korea or elsewhere, for the long-term goal of reunifying the peninsula. Karu Hasuike is told when he says, "What did you take me for?" They said, "Look, you're going to help us reunify the peninsula." He says, "This sounds crazy, but you know that's what they're going to do." He said, "Look, your forebears sinned against us in this way and that way. You're now going to help rectify that by helping us reunify the peninsula." So that's always, you know, in Korean nationalism, that's the goal, first and foremost. Whether the use of the Japanese was a rational use of resources or not is another, question. I mean, a lot of the reason I had to do so much work in the history was not just to sort of say, here's North Korean history, here's South Korean history, here's Japanese history. It's also, people don't, in fact, the reviewer for the New York Times, who's a Koreanist, people don't realize, they choose to forget that North Korea was outproducing South Korea up until the early 70s, maybe even the mid-70s. That, the idea that you could abduct someone, bring them to North Korea, and show them the splendors of the revolution was not as crazy as it sounds. We had a police state in the South, American lackeys, and you had a fairly successful industrial state, most successful because of the Japanese infrastructure that was left from the colonial era, in the North. And not only was that sort of theoretically possible, it had happened because they had been abducting South Korean fishermen throughout the 60s and 70s. These were illiterate, poor fishermen. They would bring them they'd board their boats. There was a national limit line that was ill-defined and not recognized. No one had GPS at that time. They would board these boats, take these South Koreans there. They would welcome them to the paradise. And they'd say, "Look, you're treated like crap in the South. You are the reason for the revolution." And some of them stayed. Some of them stayed and became spies. I've interviewed one of them. Some of them went back, and it was sort of a PR campaign. They'd go back, and someone would say, "You were up in North Korea. How was it?" "Well, not bad, actually. Food was nice. That kind of thing." So they had people convinced that way. It was out of date. I think I say at one point that 1978 was probably the last moment in history that you could conceivably abduct someone, bring them to North Korea, show them the splendors of the revolution, and they would sign up for the program. But what people forget too is that in 1975 there was a Juche study group in every prefecture in Japan. I mean, this was not a subculture, weird fringe thing. I mean, I've talked to doctors and lawyers in Osaka and elsewhere who used to go to Juche study group and sort of this third worldist thing, and this was not. It was more. I mean, we were very present-minded. We think about everyone's always been the way we are, but things were very different. You think about the United Red Army and the Snake and the Revolution and taking over the halls and Todai, your university, and closing it down. Right? I mean, this was a very different era, and I think the North felt it had. The wind was at its back. It believed that, and one of the problems with closed societies is you believe your own stuff. And I think that they believed that, and they believed, these people could come up, and because no one's going to say otherwise. No, we're not actually that great. The Japanese won't sign up with the program. There's no advantage to saying that. So they get behind it. And the terrorist or the follower Megumi Yao, she said, I abducted people. I knew that they would hate me and be angry, but I thought a year or two later they would thank me. This is a Japanese woman, well educated, in North Korea at the time. So this is part of the exercise of that I went through in the book of trying to understand the point of view, not justify it, not rationalize it, but you can say, oh, this was some crazy by these nutty North Koreans, or you can sort of try to think through and think, why would someone believe something like that? And I think that you have to really get rid of some of the conventional wisdom and sort of Whiggish assumptions we make. Yes.
I'm wondering about.
Yeah.
You've mentioned the North Koreans, and then you've also referenced Arimoto Keiko being abducted from Europe by Red Army people. Right. And I'm wondering, and I haven't read your book, I apologize, if you get into some of the differences between the arbitrariness of the abductions from Japan versus the targeted abductions that were happening by Japanese for North Korea and Europe.
That's a really great point. And it's, again, one of the problems, one of the complications of saying, why were there abductions? Well, there were all sorts of different kinds of abductions. There was, a poor chef named Hara who was abducted from Osaka precisely because he had no wife, no kids, no extended family, no passport, no real identity. He was a nobody, so to speak. They needed a passport. One of their spies needed a passport. He would be at the Koseki system was not yet computerized. You could do this sort of thing. So that was one reason. The randomness of the Hasuikes and the Chimuras, that was, I don't know what the reason was, but that was a random sort of thing. There are other people who were abducted for precise reasons. In the case of the students who were taken from Europe, Spain in particular, it was, as crazy as it sounds, because Kim Il-sung decided that the Yodogo hijackers, 4 of whom were still in Pyongyang, needed wives, and they were going a little bit nuts, and they needed more women there, and they went and abducted women, and men too, but women but I mean, this again gets to the sort of the semantics. They tricked them into coming. Some were told there was a job waiting for them. Some were told they were going to China, not North Korea. Those kinds of things. But they, when all is said and done, they were taken to North Korea and held there against their will. To me, that passes as abduction. But yes, and I have a whole chapter which draws largely on Takazawa Koji's fantastic book Shukume, which is, extraordinary work. Just published in English, by the way. There you go. Well, there you go. You're one of her Pat's students. Yeah. Yes.
It's often mentioned that one of the uses of the abductees was to train North Korean spies and agents in impersonating Japanese. Now, there were a lot of pro-North Korean residents of Japan who are Japanese speaking or familiar with Japanese culture. Mm-hmm. Why would you use a Japanese who may be disloyal to North Korea? It's pretty good reason. It's not fun to be abducted. Right. Well, you can take a pro-North Korean Japanese who knows everything about Japan, speaks the language without an accent, knows about the cultural norms, and is vastly more reliable.
Right, right.
And if need be, if you're afraid that you will know about the agent's identities, you can always kill him after he's done teaching.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
no, this was one of the questions I had. Traditionally we hire people to do things like this. And I came up with a bunch of different answers as I talked to all sorts of much more knowledgeable Pyongyang watchers. And the Japanese are among the best. The Japanese journalists are the best Pyongyang watchers, I find. And the reasons I came up with were that if they took someone from Chosen-sor and Chongrong groups who were indeed going back and forth and stuff, they would be missed. They have family here, they have family there. If they trade in spies, you can't let them go, and you can't kill them. So that people who were abducted would be, wouldn't be traceable, I guess was the idea. The other reason was that, and this was part of, again, we think about Kim Jong-il surpassing or replacing Kim Il-sung and as if this were, the way it was always going to be that way. But there was actually a lot of competition for the job, and Kim Jong-il had to really, make his bones, as it were, and prove himself. And one of the ways he did that was by revamping North Korean intelligence services. And he was very upset because a whole bunch of North Korean spies who had been captured by the South Koreans had over the years not done what they were supposed to do and take your cigarette with the cyanide capsule, which is actually how one of the people who bombed that plane died. But they hadn't done that. They just sat there and talked and told them everything. So they were kind of annoyed by that. They recalled a lot of their spies, and then they decided, he said, I want a modern, Dad, the world was, you're so old. The world was a simpler place. Now it's much more complicated. I want the most up-to-date. I want Japanese who were, walking in Shibuya yesterday and know exactly what to wear and what to say and what to do. I want, Thai people I want Lebanese people. I want Chinese people. So this abduction was a global phenomenon, and it was to get the best and the brightest, the freshest there to either, in the best of circumstances, spy. Secondary would have them train other spies. So I think that's among those reasons. Those are some of the things that pulled that. Yes, sir. About North Korea? About the nuclear issue, yes. I think so. I mean, you can't tweet about the nuclear issue and about Kim Jong-un over and over again and not raise, awareness is a thin term, but, yes, I think people are more aware of it. I don't think that he raised any awareness about abduction or about Megumi, even by mentioning her name in the United Nations or by meeting with sadly, meeting with the families here, as he did. All that to me attests to the fact that Prime Minister Abe is a brilliant flatterer and has played Trump like a, harp, 100%. And Moon Jae-in is getting in on it today. I don't know if you saw Moon Jae-in talking about what Trump did a terrific job getting the North to the negotiating table. He's sort of thinking, well, I see how far he got by flattery. Maybe I'll do some of that too, But I don't think it's, alas, I've been asked a lot by various newspapers, Sankei and others, about is this going to raise the issue, the consciousness of the issue, and I don't think it will. I really think that joining forces with the existing human rights apparatus about North Korean human rights, which has grown tremendously in the last 10 years and become very global, and through the COI and in the UN and through the vast literature that's nonfiction literature, Barbara Demick's book, other books that have really made North Korea live in the imagination. I think it's made it ripe for people to get exercised about human rights. When you can imagine these people as real individual people over there, not caricatures or stereotypes of sufferers in the gulag, as awful as that, the reality of that is, then I think you can have a certain kind of empathy. And I think I see it in the student movement in the United States. The Korean American students, there's one of the biggest reasons that North Korean defectors, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was not that hard to get from North Korea to China, but it was impossible to get out of China. I've met defectors who've spent 10, 15 years in China. Now they spend about a year, maybe 2. And that's because of various NGOs and other who are in Thailand and elsewhere who are getting them out. So, some real changes have happened, and that's an important movement. Okay? Yes, Robert.
You've alluded to the South Koreans being abducted. There are many more South Koreans who are abducted than North Koreans. Yet the issue seems to be much less salient in South Korea. Can you talk about that? And also the second thing you've mentioned, I didn't know about this, about the Thai, the Lebanese. Yeah. Can you talk about the globalization of abductions? Yeah, because that's something that's totally undercovered. I had no idea they'd gotten Lebanese.
Yes, the United Nations of Abduction, I call it sometimes. The Lebanese was an interesting one. They tricked, I think, 4 Lebanese women into going to North Korea to be secretaries, very highly paid secretaries. And when it turned out that was not the case, through the Lebanese Communist Party, they were able to get government action to get them out. And then one of them came back pregnant, who had been paired up with one of these American defectors, Larry Abashir. And the family said, no, back to North Korea you go. And she's there to this day. And she claims not to be abducted, and she has kids. And the Romanian woman, too, she married one of the Americans, a really loathsome guy who just died recently. And his sons, you can look on YouTube, his sons are there. They're very Eastern European-looking Caucasians wearing North Korean military uniforms, speaking perfect Korean. So there are sort of detritus of this whole thing there. The South Korean abductees is something that I care a lot about. I very consciously wanted this book to be about both, because as you say, there are more, roughly 500 South Korean abductees, both from POWs from the Korean War down to students taken in the 70s, fishermen taken in the 60s and 70s. And but I simply couldn't fit it into the narrative. It was so damn hard to figure out a story that would take me through that to then curve over and say, oh, by the way, here are all these South Korean abductees. But I spent a tremendous amount of time in Seoul reporting on that as well. And I'm trying to think of a way to write about that in the future. But, I was just at this event at KO. I think one or two of you were there at this one. And one of the really interesting women's, a reporter from a South Korean paper was talking about the lack of interest there. I mean, the anti-communist background in South Korea makes anything that has a hint of North Korean very hard to deal with. That's why the defectors are treated so badly, and there's tremendous social ill, levels of drunkenness, of drug abuse, of joblessness, all sorts of stuff experienced by the defectors who are rejected by South Korean society and find they can't compete in this incredibly competitive, commercialized, acquisitive society. So the abductees who are there are really languishing, and they have nothing like the support that the Japanese government has given to these movements and their visibility. I mean, the guy, there's a man named Chae Song-young, who's this sort of, retired fisherman who's got a citizens group, and there are a few others. The thing that sort of I find amazing, though, is that for all of their sort of lack of resources, they've gotten 3 or 4 of these abductees out of North Korea. And I've interviewed them. They're people who have escaped, and they played a certain kind of game. They get them out the same way other people get out. They go to human traffickers. They pay them money. Half the times the traffickers get caught, and God knows what happens to them. They don't care. They finally get them out. So there has been not tremendous, but there's been some success in freeing some abductees who are there, who they've been able to locate. And it's an amazing story, some amazing stories. But the public is just not, first during, the Kim Dae-jung years, which is right around when few of them start coming out, the government gave no attention, to any of the defectors, even the very high level, Hyang Wang-jap, got, basically shunned for years until less liberal governments came in. So certainly under Moon Jae-in, there's not going to be any celebration or support for something that could potentially irritate the North, I think. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Kashiyama. I'm from a Japanese newspaper, Sankei Shimbun. I'm a junior colleague of Mr. Abe. My question is very simple. What is the solution of this issue? Well, I think by my private idea, it's
I had a funny feeling you had a private idea for this issue.
Either military action or otherwise normalization of diplomatic relationship. If we normalize the diplomatic relationship, probably automatically this issue will be wrapped up. But I'm not sure. Do you have any good idea?
Sure, I do have an idea. I mean, that was the hope, right, behind the Koizumi negotiations, was that normalization and abduction one would lead to the other one. And so I think you're right in that sense. I mean, my idea is just that, in the same way that human rights groups have made a conscious decision to not link aid, food aid in particular, to politics, right? A missile goes up, the rice that's needed in Wonsan still goes over there. They don't say, that's it, no more rice, no more food aid because you've acted badly politically. What if there were negotiations on human rights issues, on these human rights things? Families there, families here, sort of like the family reunion between North and South Korea, but between Japan and North Korea. And it was set up explicitly saying, these are apolitical, not going to be changed by events on either side. Either side could act as badly or as poorly with as many sanctions or not as you want. We're just going to have people doing nothing but talking about resolving this human exchange issue, whether it's Japanese wives who went with the returned people, whether it's remains for Japanese from the war, whether it's abductees, whatever it is. We're going to have them cordoned off. It's going to be a different thing. I mean, who am I? But that that makes sense, right? I mean, it's just about human rights. If only we had someone from human rights in the Japanese government here who could bring something like that to the government. But, that'll never happen.
I would like to know just one thing.
Yes.
You mentioned twice or three times Mr. Abe.
Hi.
He recently, very recently, beginning of this month, he started to the series of featured stories.
Yeah, a new column. I have the first issue.
Yeah, that's also very interesting. So I really want all of this series.
Yeah, in the last week's Sankei Shimbun, they had the facsimile of the first cover story where Mr. Abe had his story announcing this third country had abducted these people. It's incredible. I mean, the story about I've never met him. I've actually asked people at Sankei to introduce. Maybe you'll introduce me, but I'm curious how the hell he came up with this story and made these connections, and I've never heard a good explanation of it.
Any other questions? We have time for one more question. If somebody from the government wants to speak, they can, but they don't have to.
If he were here.
Yeah, if we were here. So,
Yes, sure.
just one brief question, one brief answer, and then we'll.
You were talking about south going to north. I'd like to add another point, Japan to north. When in the 1960s, and now you can guess my age, one of my good friends here in Tokyo was a delegate of the International Red Cross. And there was a tremendous flow of originally Korean people going on their own to North Korea, to the workers' paradise. And my friend's job was when, for instance, they would say from Korea, we need 500 tailors. And within 2 weeks, 500 tailors would be in Niigata to wait for the ferry to come and bring them to the workers' paradise. And my friend's job was he had to interview each of them individually, privately, to make sure that they really want to go and not are not kind of forced to go.
I tell that story in the book about the Declaration of Free Will. You got to read this book. It's a good book. No, I have a whole chapter about that and about the return home movement and the people who, like I'm sure knew your friend, who helped these people leave voluntarily is a question, but they were encouraged. But yes, this was a question. It was all overseen by the United Nations, and at a certain point, when this demand was inserted that they have to make a declaration of free will on an individual basis, the North Koreans said, "That's it, forget it." They shut the whole thing down. And people were arriving by train in Niigata, and they couldn't get them up. And they finally worked out an agreement that they would interview people not as individuals, but as families, and the room in which they interviewed them would not have doors, so that it could be heard. And I have a long section on a woman named Saito Hiroko, who had married to one of the Zainichi who was going, and she and her sister-in-law, who was also Japanese, had decided that they couldn't go, and they were going to take the opportunity of this interview when they could speak privately to say, no, we can't go. But The rules changed. They went with the whole family. The patriarch spoke. He said, yes, we're all going by free will. And she spent the next 45 years in North Korea until she escaped. Read the book.
Well, thank you very much,
you.
Robert.